We're going to consider the question, can a machine think, on this episode of the Sci Fi Show. We're using the 2004 film I, Robot to ask the question, can a machine think? It turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question. In I, Robot we have three basic types of thinking machine that exist in the film. There's the mainframe at USR, Vicky, Sunny, and the other NS5 series robots. There are a host of other robots in the film, but these are probably the three that drive the question, with the NS5 robots being much the same as the NS4 series robots they are replacing. Can any of these machines think? Do they have a mind? It really depends on what it means to think and what it means to have a mind. There are two broad schools of thought in the philosophy of mind, and depending on which one of these a person thinks is true, will strongly influence how they will answer the question. There are two basic divisions in the philosophy of mind. On one side you have the dualists, and on the other the monists. The dualists claim that ultimately mind and body are two different things, that one cannot be reduced to the other because they're not the same. The principal problem confronting the dualist is the mind-body problem, in which they seek to deal with the question of how the mind and body interact. There are a number of ways of dealing with this. The two broad schools of dualist thought are substance and property dualism. The substance dualist claims that the mind is not the same kind as the body and is made of something else. The word soul or spirit is prominent in such thinking. The property dualist, on the other hand, says that although a mind can be made of physical stuff, like your brain, the mind has properties that cannot be reduced to the functioning of the brain, that there is an irreducible quality to the mind. The dualists divide into a number of other schools as well. Whether they are substance or property dualists, the next distinction is related to the causal power of the mind to affect the body, and vice versa. The most straightforward position are those that are termed interactionism and non-reductive physicalism. These two positions contend that the mind is able to causally interact with the body, and are both based in the observation that I can will my body to do different things, and it appears to respond to my commands. The main distinction between them seems to be that interactionists are substance dualists, while non-reductive physicalists are property dualists. Next we have what has always struck me as a strange set of positions called occasionalism or parallelism. What both positions hold in common is that the mind and the body are not causally interactive at all, but it just appears that way. Generally due to the direct action of God, or because God set up things in advance to play out that way. It seems like a rather extreme way to solve the problem of mind-body interaction. Finally, in the dualist camp, we have a school of thought, all property dualists to the best of my knowledge, that claim that the causal interaction of mind and body goes one way, with the body affecting and producing the mind, but that these productions are causally inert. This position is known as epiphenomenalism. The monist, by contrast, contends that ultimately there's only one thing, and that the other is reducible to it. Either the mind is reducible to the functioning of matter, or the material world is ultimately just an aspect or manifestation of the mind. These two positions are known as materialism and idealism, respectively. In the West today, most monists fall into the materialist school of thought. There's also a third monist tradition called neutral monism that contends that the dualist mind-body distinction is mistaken because all material and mind is made up of some common substance. The materialistic monists also come in a number of different varieties. These fall into ideas like behaviorism, token identity theory, functionalism, and others. All of these would be worthy of a show in their own right, and we will come back to them. However, for now, the basic idea is that you're attempting to reduce the functioning of the mind to patterns of neurons firing in the brain. Fundamentally, the materialist's enterprise seeks to do away with the notion of mind entirely and reduce it merely to brain. This is an ambitious project, but I think it may be quite problematic. The biggest problem the project seems to face, and epiphenomenalism seems to share the same basic problem, is that if it succeeds and demonstrates what it claims to demonstrate, then it will show that there's no I at the center of consciousness, that there's no such thing as you, but instead just a series of complex interactions reducible to the firing of neurons. The problem I see with this is that the entire enterprise rests on making an argument and offering reasons for why the argument is rational. But if the argument succeeds, then it will have demonstrated that there's no mind to address the argument to. The consciousness being addressed doesn't really exist. And the same will be true of the researcher making the argument, that there will be no them to be making an argument. It seems a little strange to deny what is probably the only thing you can actually be 100% sure of, that you exist and that you're a thinking being. Everything else is open to at least some level of skepticism, even your perceptions. But that you're a thinking centre of consciousness, even if you're the only one, seems something that each individual knows about themselves with certainty. Everything else may be in doubt, but Descartes' maxim, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, seems indisputable. Finally, there is another dimension to all of this thinking about the nature of the mind. This position, which cuts across all of the other schools of thought, is a question about whether the mind is an emergent property or not. An emergent property is one that doesn't exist at the individual component level, but is observable in the complete system. It runs counter to a reductionist approach that seeks to understand a system by understanding each of its components. A simple example of emergence as a property is water being wet. Individual water atoms don't contain wetness, but it's a property that a large aggregation of water atoms have due to the interactions between them. The claim is that something analogous happens with things like consciousness and minds. You'll never understand the mind if you try to reduce it to its component neurons, but taken as a whole, the mind is an emergent property of all the underlying wiring once it reaches a certain level of complexity. Interestingly, this doesn't have to be incompatible with even a substance dualist position. Peter F. Hamilton, author of the Reality Dysfunction series, explores this very idea, with the idea that a soul is created when a mind reaches a certain level of complexity, and that this soul is able to persist after the death of the body. Some theistic philosophers have proposed a mechanism like this for the origin of the soul, while others have postulated the soul as some pre-existing entity that is attached to the body during the process of development. All of this brings us back to Sonny and the other machines in iRobot. Are they minds? Detective Spooner, skeptical of all things robotic, dismisses the mind of the NS4 series robot that saved his life as merely a difference engine that wasn't capable of thinking in a suitably human way, as it chose to save him instead of the young girl. Although this seems to be a question of making emotive valuations rather than strictly empirical ones. Perhaps that's a requirement for thinking. It seems the NS5s are similarly limited. What would it mean for a robot to be able to think? It raises a number of interesting questions, but I'm not sure if we will solve anything when we manage to build a machine that we are convinced is capable of thinking. After all, telling when a machine can think turns out to be a really difficult problem. In iRobot, it seems to be clear that Vicky and Sonny are capable of thinking, and Sonny even dreams. Vicky is driven by the logic of the 3 laws of robotics programmed into her to enslave all of humanity for their own good. Doesn't seem like she could have reached any other conclusion, though. How is this different from the thinking that a computer does when it executes operations based on a pre-programmed set of statements that react to inputs and outputs in a deterministic fashion? That the procedure is much more complicated doesn't seem to change its underlying reality. It seems reasonable to conclude a computer program executing a predefined series of statements based on some set of input isn't thinking about what it's doing. It's just manipulating abstract symbols. Is this what we do when we think? That doesn't seem to be the case. Consider a real-life example like Deep Blue. For a long time, the holy grail of AI research was to build a machine that could beat a human at chess. When it was finally completed and Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, it became evident that even though it was an impressive achievement, whatever Deep Blue is doing, it isn't thinking as we normally conceive of it. There have been recent attempts to move in a different direction, including making poker-playing AIs, because poker requires the ability to analyze a problem and make decisions on incomplete information, something not required of a chess player. There have been a number of attempts to build thinking machines, and also a number of attempts to work out how you would tell when a machine is thinking and when it is not. The most famous of these is probably Alan Turing's Turing test. The Turing test asks an observer to try to distinguish a human being from a computer when the observer is limited to communicating in some way that hides the origin of the communicator. If the human can converse with the machine in a way indistinguishable from conversing with a human, then the machine is said to have passed the Turing test. The philosopher John Searle proposed a thought experiment called the Chinese Room as a rebuttal of this idea. In the Chinese room, you have a man who receives an abstract set of instructions, symbols on a piece of paper, not something in a language he understands. And then the man uses books he has to find the appropriate symbol and look up the response, and then replies to the message with the set of symbols he's looked up. Unknown to the man in the room, he is communicating in fluent Chinese, even though from his perspective, he is just doing abstract symbol manipulation and has no understanding of the symbols he is manipulating. Is it fair to say the man knows Chinese? Or perhaps the room as a whole knows Chinese? It's a fairly good description of what computers do whenever you ask them to process information. The machine abstractly manipulates the symbols given to it based on a set of rules without having any understanding of what it's doing. It seems that the NS4s and NS5s could easily be very complex examples of Searle's Chinese room, as might Vicky. What about Sunny? How would you tell? Could a machine have a soul? Is a soul a requirement for a mind at all, or will a sufficient level of complexity suffice? If a soul is an emergent property, does it require a biological substrate to form? Other questions arise as well. If a mind will arise given sufficient complexity of an appropriate sort, will that mind have free will? Dr. Alfred Lanier makes a reference to random snippets of code that might allow for the formation and operation of a mind. However, this raises a question of free will and determinism that we'll get to in a future episode. Is a mind made of random coding different, really free, or just noisy and random in an otherwise deterministic fashion? What of some sort of emotion? It seems Sunny has access to some level of emotion Vicky does not, and that this is part of the difference between the two. Could emotions be a more crucial component in a mind than mere logic? iRobot asks far more questions than it answers. I hope that you've enjoyed this overview of the philosophy of mind, and we will continue to explore this area in next week's episode. You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode of the show on scifishow.com. I can also be reached with comments via thescifishow@gmail.com. You can leave comments in the show notes at scifishow.com, and you can also leave comments on our Facebook page, facebook.com/scifishow. If there's a topic you would like me to look into, please don't hesitate to ask. Let me know what you think. Sci-Fi Show is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license, and the music is provided by Furious J and Maniacal M.